These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Black Studies and the Black University. Africa World Now Project is next. The great political theorist, cultural philosopher, insightful writer, C.L.R. James, once said that he is black, number one, because he is against what they have done and are still doing to us. And number two, he has something to say about the new society to be built, because he has a tremendous part in that which they have sought to discredit. In the article, The University and the Undercommons, 7 Theses, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney start their analysis with this powerful quote. To the university I still, and there I still. They go on to write that this is the only possible relationship to the university today. In fact, this may be true of universities everywhere. It cannot be denied that the university is a place of refuge, and it cannot be accepted that the university is a place of enlightenment. Their analysis is centered on a sharp critique on how we produce and reproduce certain forms of knowledge, and the role and responsibility of those who step into this dialectical process of who has the right to know and what they should do with what they know. Moten and Harney go on to suggest that in the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the university and steal what we can, to abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, to be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in the modern university. The authors are attempting to peel back the cover of knowledge for knowledge's sake. They suggest that in this present moment, we must begin to take the path of heretical thinkers. The Maroons knew something about possibility. They are the condition of possibility of production of knowledge in the university. The singularities against the writers of singularity. The writers who write, publish, travel, speak. It is not merely a matter of the secret labor upon which such space is lifted, though of course such space is lifted from collective labor and by it. It is rather that to be a critical academic in the university is to be against the university. And to be against the university is always to recognize it and be recognized by it. And to institute the negligence of that internal outside, that unassimilated underground. A negligence of it that is precisely, we must insist, the basis of the professions. And this act of against always exclude the unrecognized modes of politics, the beyond of politics already in motion, the discredited criminal para-organization, what Robin Kelly might refer to as the infra-political field and its music. It is not just the labor of the Maroons, but their prophetic organization that is negated by the idea of intellectual space in an organization called the university. Next, we will hear a further elaboration of the ideas set out by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney with Dr. Claudrena Harold, author of New Negro Politics in the Jim Crow South from University of Virginia, Dr. Will Boone, Dr. Coy Walker, and myself of Winston-Salem State University. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
It's indeed an honor to be here today to talk about, to discuss and engage a topic that we've been preoccupied with as a group for just as individual scholars for a number of years around Black studies in the Black university. And we take it from a number of different vantage points. from our positions located at historically black colleges, from our intellectual interests, from the intellectual work that's been developed at black colleges, particularly during the moment of the black freedom struggle, the latter half of the 20th century. We're also interested relative to the questions that have been raised around the Black University, and the series of articles, of course, found on the pages of Negro Digest from that famous Howard University symposium. And of course, most recently, we've all witnessed an emergence of a discussion on black study and the university on the pages of the Boston Review that talks about the recent uprisings around college campuses in the U.S. and the idea of the university. So what we've done is pull together a panel of individuals who begin to engage this protein formation and look at what we offer some insights, both from contemporary perspectives and also informed by some historical perspectives, and opening up new archives for us to begin to engage this nexus, and also begin to open up with some questions and a dialogue that we hope will be very instructive as we continue this ongoing discussion. So joining me on this conversation will be William Boone, right toward the end on my right. Boone is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of English at Winston-Salem State University. He completed his work in African and African American Studies at Temple University, and has been at Winston-Salem State now for a little over 8 years. So Boone, he'll go first. The newest member, next will be Claudrina Harold, who's a longtime companion, author of a first book on Garvey, and second book that'll be out soon, right, with University of Georgia Press. Claudrina Harold is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. She completed her work at Notre Dame and her undergraduate work at Temple. She's been at the University of Virginia now for over about 12 years. And Claudrina and I were first colleagues at UVA when she first joined Virginia. Just an outstanding colleague and scholar. And it's great to be reunited with Claudrina on this panel. James Pope, our newest member of the faculty down at Winston-Salem State. Pope just joined us about a year ago. Completed his graduate work at Howard University. Also did a year's teaching at Virginia Commonwealth University in African and African American Studies, and also taught both at Howard and at Georgetown. And James Pope is an assistant professor in the Department of Liberal Studies, where he heads up our African and African American Studies program, soon to be renamed Africana Studies program. And then followed by myself. Now, Corey, I'm a dean, but I'm also the Haynes Professor of the Humanities at Winston-Salem State. So we'll first begin with Will, who will offer us some provocative remarks, and then we'll move to Claudrina, then Pope, and then myself, and then we'll engage in robust conversation. So, thank you.
How you doing? All right, I want to, before I read my short essay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, just kind of piece through it. I want to begin by stating that I consider myself a disciplinary heretic. So I come out of English literature. I'm a chair of the English department. I'm a PhD in African American Studies, but I'm always trying to, like I say, disrupt those disciplinary epistemologies. And also I'm an HBCU alumni. So my analysis actually falls in between. So hopefully we have some spirited discussion with the understanding that I understand somewhat both arenas. So the title of my presentation is Intellectual Plantations, Academic Maroons, and the Future of Black Studies. So I'll begin with a quote from Dean Corey Walker from a piece published in the University of Chicago Divinity School's journal. If we are to create a moral vision that will support the noble strivings of higher education while nurturing a robust democratic polity, we can do no better than turn to the most embattled higher educational institutions which continue to struggle for democracy, our nation's historically black colleges and universities. So I was wrestling with this major question of where should black studies be positioned within the context of historically black colleges and universities? And so I was trying to wrestle with this question as an administrator at a historically black college. Professor Corey Walker reminds us of the inextricable link between higher education, race, and the ideals of democracy. In regard to black studies, historically black colleges and universities have been the cradle of the black studies movement. Because of black studies' historical roots and intellectual genealogy in historically black college, or at historically black college universities, it is inextricably linked to black universities. Moving forward, black universities should be at the center of the black studies movement. This essay takes up the question of black studies at historically black universities, more notably the question of how black studies should be positioned within 21st century black universities, or HBCUs. My title draws attention to what Robin D.G. Kelly described in a recent essay mentioned by Professor Walker in the Boston Review, entitled Black Study, Black Struggle, as the contradictory impulses within the black studies movement, the tension between reform and revolution, between desiring to belong and rejecting the university as a cog in the neoliberal order. Kelly's analysis provides cues to broader tensions within the black studies movement. More specifically, the epistemological and experiential tension between the ebony and ivory towers. The slave plantation and the Maroon Society then serve as signifiers for this tension. Within this context, we can view the struggle within black studies as an intellectual power struggle for humanity, which plays out within the colonized modes of thought and knowledge production of the academy. In his response to Vincent Harding in the March 1970 issue of Negro Digest, which we're using as sort of a platform to discuss these ideas, titled The Black University in Peril Before Birth, Ronald Davis highlighted the challenges of institutionalization for early African American studies programs. And I quote, "If education was to play a part in our survival, it would have to go a radical change." What was the scope and tone of the radical change Professor Davis advocates for? According to Davis, many of the founders of early black studies programs were against full-on institutionalization. In short, early black studies scholars were concerned with black studies faculty getting caught up in institutions. They were so pessimistic of the ability, they were so pessimistic of the deleterious effects of the academy that they even considered banning tenure altogether. From their perspective, the lure of the cushy, privileged life of academia could potentially undermine the black studies movement and at worst attract vulgar careerists and hustlers. And Davis is very pointed there. He describes some of these academicians that were attracted to black studies early on as hustlers. Okay, so from this perspective, black universities can provide much needed conceptual space in an autocratic world of intellectual thought. As Robin D.G. Kelly explains, the university is not a transformative space, or has limitations. So to explore these possibilities, black studies scholars must, at times, break the rules, and that's my reference to the Maroon Societies. As Kelly states, black studies were conceived not just outside the university, but in opposition to a Eurocentric university culture with ties to corporate and military power. In the vocation of the black scholar and the struggles of the black community, Vincent Harding argues that African American scholars should serve as liberating agents of social historical change for African American students. Harding challenges American notions of the detached academician, while situating the black scholar within the context of African American community struggle. Harding posed several key questions that can inform the cartographies of black studies in the 21st century. What are the stakes for which we struggle? What are the goals toward which we now move? What do liberation, independence, authentic black humanity, self-determination, in italics, victory mean in the world of the 1970s and 80s? What is the nature of the society we seek? As the recent meteoric rise of the Black Lives Matter movement illustrates, black students, and as a result black studies, is still wrestling with these philosophical questions. Harding posed these questions in the early 1970s. Stacey Patton picks up on this discussion in an article on the future of black studies at elite institutions entitled Black Studies Swaggering into the Future. And hopefully we can delve more into that. I don't have time here. In the piece, Professor Mark Anthony Neal of Duke's Black Study program argues that elite institutions are swaggering into the future. The Black Studies programs are swaggering into the future, which makes me think about the performance of Black Studies, again, which hopefully we can talk about in our Q&A. Black universities then should be at the center of the 21st century's Black Studies movement, as they provide the possibilities for a more direct, unfettered path to African American communities, sans the performative aspects. And 2 more paragraphs. Black universities offer the most fertile, sustainable, and stable foundation for Black studies, both in terms of its grounding in intellectual genealogy and its institutional autonomy. These paths should serve as institutional and scholarly bridges, not as spaces to replicate and adopt Eurocentric approaches. Moreover, they should serve as spaces to explore new epistemological and methodological models, which, according to Walter Rodney, we must become guerrilla intellectuals. So I'll end with a few questions. How will Black Studies re-envision the university? And how will Black Studies re-envision itself within the context of Black universities? And this is actually a more important question, how can Black Studies facilitate African American students' intellectual imagination, not only at Black institutions, but PWIs? I think that's a really important question. And then can the concept of the Black university articulated in Davis's article even be realized within the cultural political milieu of the 21st century, as we talk about Trump and this upcoming election? So I think that raises some serious questions as to our ability to become effective in some of our earlier goals within the Black Studies movement. To cite Harding, what does victory mean for Black Studies in light of its historical origins at historically Black colleges? So I'll close here. Similar to the great Maroon societies of the 1800s, Black universities must serve as maroon spaces, safe spaces, where Black studies scholars can find refuge and respite from the plantation of ideas of the ivory tower. I offer 10 recommendations for Black studies at Black universities, and my intent is to provide a cursory outline and entry point to discuss the role of Black studies at Black universities. These recommendations reflect the tone and spirit of Black studies scholarship as debated in the March 1970 issue of Negro Digest, because I think that's an important element of how we should move forward. I think there was a deliberate tone to the conversations that were taking place in the 1970s. So I'll just read a couple. HBCUs, as they relate to Black studies, should serve as disciplinary bridges across disciplines, across institutions, across departments. I would argue that Black studies at HBCUs should be subversive. We should be pushing back in various ways. We also need to rethink our research methodologies and methods. We should foster radical epistemologies that transcend disciplinary boundaries. That should be a goal. That should be the type of intellectual world we imagine. We should safeguard against intellectual imperialism. We're having conversations at Winston-Salem State around decolonizing study abroad as we move to Cuba, as Black studies moves to Cuba. How does this look? What does this look like? What is our role as HBCU professors and Black studies scholars? We must become translators of cultures and ideas. We must be grounded in an ethic of love and healing. And Kelly references that in his article in the Boston Review. We must provide alternative streams of radical thinking, new possibilities of critical epistemologies. We must become cultural educational pioneers, new frontiers, again, of fearlessness, new heights, new paradigms, experimentation. We must be moral visionaries anchored in truth and social justice, and that speaks to Corey Walker's piece, and it speaks to Harding's piece. And then last but not least, and Harding is very deliberate here, we must identify the enemy. And again, who that enemy is another conversation, but I think that has to be at the forefront of what we're doing at universities within the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here for a variety of reasons. One is one of the founding members of the National Council of Black Studies was Vivian Gordon, and for the past 5 years she has sort of occupied my life. I teach the Intro to African American and African Studies course at the University of Virginia, and one of my sort of pedagogical challenges teaching at Virginia was to make the work relevant to my students in a particular kind of way. And one of the things that I discovered was that when I focused on Virginia, there was a way in which they paid a particular kind of attention. So when I organized that course intellectually, for example, I deal a lot with Virginia Union. I deal a lot with the central role of Virginia Union in the creation of sort of black social science. We walk through people like Abram Harris and Charles Johnson and Charles Thompson. We talk about the ways in which during its centennial, when Horace Mann Bond gave the centennial address, he mentioned that he couldn't think of any university of its size that had been responsible for the training of more black social scientists than Virginia Union. We also go through the 1940s and we begin to talk about the development of theology at Virginia Union. We talk about the central role that Virginia Union played sort of in black liberation theology during the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course we have to move to Virginia State, and we talk about the centrality and the importance of someone like Luther Porter Jackson, who played a critical role in Vivian Gordon's sort of intellectual formation. She talks about, in a talk that she gives in 1984 at the University of Virginia, when she was in 7th grade and Luther Porter Jackson asked her a question. He said, "Young girl, what do you want to do with your life?" And so he played a critical role in her formation. Vivian Gordon was born in 1934. She was born in Washington, D.C., but actually she was raised she reared on the campus of Virginia State in Petersburg. I'm from Florida, I always say St. Petersburg, but Petersburg. Her father was Thomas Verdell. Her father actually integrated Northwestern as a football player, but he was actually the athletic director at Virginia State. And Vivian Gordon became a sort of central part of my introduction to African American Studies course, which looks at the formation of black studies at the University of Virginia. UVA created its first black studies. The black studies program at UVA was created in 1969, 1970. The first director actually was Howard's Houston Baker. Houston Baker was a faculty member. The first director was actually noted religious studies scholar Joseph Washington. Houston Baker and Washington come around the same time. Vivian Gordon enrolls in the PhD program in sociology in 1969. She graduates in 1974. She actually becomes the director of African American Studies at the University of Virginia in 1975, and she remains until 1980. 1980 is the year when Armstead Robinson leaves UCLA, and they actually have this big intellectual debate over the direction of black studies at the University of Virginia, the question of the department model versus the institute model. And in doing that debate, Vivian Gordon, who is beloved by her students, actually brings in the National Council of Black Studies to intervene in this conversation. And needless to say, there was ways in which white administrators, were not comfortable with having NCBS come in and have this conversation about the field. She eventually leaves in 1983. But in 1987, the students, the Black Student Alliance, they bring her back, and she gives this powerful speech about black studies, but more importantly, the centrality of Virginia State in her intellectual trajectory. And in 2011, a good friend of mine, a filmmaker, we decided to do a film on black studies at the University of Virginia and center around sort of the intellectual life of black studies, the intellectual life, the political life, the cultural life of African American students at the University of Virginia. And we really didn't have a script. And we wanted to make it a short film. The filmmaker is Kevin Everson, who's done probably, I think now, about 15 features and probably 700 shorts. He also did a short with Kevin called Fifeville. And so we decided that we were going to look at African American life at the University of Virginia. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to sort of capture a moment. I wanted to try the idea of what would black studies look like on film? Like, what would black studies look like in 8 minutes on like black and white film? Because I'm also interested in this question of form, and I think there's certain stories, there are certain textures, there are certain moments, and to sort of quote Vincent Harding, he says, how do you capture spirit? I think there are certain spirits that you can't capture through book form. And so I was committed to, doing this film, and Kevin is very much about form, so, he made the decision that the form would be based on Horace Ove's Baldwin's Nigger. And I actually wanted to show the film because the film is about 10 minutes, and all of the camera, all of the gestures in the film is organized around, it's really it's a tribute in many ways to Horace Ove. And so the film, we decided on the form, but we didn't have a script. We didn't have a script a month before we were going to shoot. And we had an actor, but we also involved our students. It's very important to me that students are involved in these kind of projects. And we decided on, we finally found this speech that she had given, and the speech is actually 2 hours. And for those of you who are very much interested in the history of Black Studies and Vivian Gordon, I encourage you to check out the speech. It's actually on a website called blackfireuva.com. But in the speech, there's this moment where she reflects on her experience at Virginia State and what Luther Porter Jackson meant to her in terms of her intellectual development. And so what we did was we organized the script around key moments in this speech. And while this was an amazing experience, one of the things that became very clear to me was there's a certain kind of spirit and there's a certain kind of intellectual project that you're never going to be able to capture at a white college. And so for me, the idea of toward a Black university and its relationship to Black studies, for me, as I think about what I'm going to do at the University of Virginia, it's increasingly less towards Black studies and more towards a Black university. And what I mean by that is really my intellectual models, whether they be Virginia Union. And those were her models. She was in the sociology department when she was building African American studies. When she was writing, for example, her seminal 1981 essay that you can find in Nathaniel Norman's Reader. That particular essay was based on her experience at the University of Virginia. But that particular essay, if you look through her papers, and her papers are actually at Virginia State University, and one of the great tragedies is that those papers have been at Virginia State University for quite some time. They're not processed yet. I mean, I think these are also conversations that we have to have about toward a Black university. And it's not just her history. There's a history of Obasi. There's a history of the National Council of Black Studies. Vivian Gordon died of Lou Gehrig's disease, and it's very clear that she got sick very quickly. So one of the most emotionally jarring experiences for me was to go in Virginia State, and at that time they were like, yeah, you can go and look at the files, was just to see her handbags, and handbags from ASCAC, handbags from NCBS that had never been opened. I would say there's about 50 unprocessed instant cameras in the files. And now I'm moving to the archive, but I think talking about the archive is so important, which is why it's ludicrous in many ways for anybody to say they're going to write a definitive history of Black studies. It's just ludicrous. For one, just because of what exists at Virginia State. It's also ludicrous I can also talk about South Carolina State. So I do a lot of stuff with Virginia. The other white school that I do include a lot is VCU. And VCU, their first president of the African American Studies program was a guy by the name of Rutledge Dennis. And Rutledge Dennis was a graduate of South Carolina State. All of his papers are processed. I think I looked through his papers in 2011. I was also told that I was the first person that ever looked through his papers in 2011. But him and Vivian Gordon had a very close relationship. And so once again, there's no writing of this history. If we're going to say we're going to do a definitive history of black studies, and you haven't examined the archives, you know, beyond Howard, you can't write that history. You just can't write the history. You can't write a definitive history if you haven't thought through what they were doing in political science at Atlanta University. You can't write that definitive history if you're not thinking about what they were doing in theology at Virginia Union. And I'm bringing up these issues, or in terms of development. If you go through North Carolina A&T in the 1960s and the 1970s, they were having a series of conversations about this issue of urban and rural development in their economics department. So in some ways, you can't begin to write a history. And in fact, you begin to understand the conceptual limitations of just saying black studies, because they're doing something that's completely different. And I think I'm going to stop right there because I feel like I'm going in a lot of different places. But I do want to bring up, and I mention these sources too because I think everybody needs to embrace these sources, and we need to think about how we sort of organize these sources and how we access these sources. Because once again, I don't think you can do that kind of work without it. Just one more thing in terms of the film and talking about Towards a Black University. The first film that I did is called Sugar-Coated Arsenic, and if anybody wants a link, Vimeo link, I'll give it to you since I had technology problems. And it's played at a lot of different film festivals. Unfortunately, it's played a lot in Europe, and so I mean it's good in some ways, but it's bad in some ways because I always feel obligated. I want people who knew Vivian Gordon to see this film. I just have a certain feeling about that. The second film that Kevin and I just did, and we played at the Berlin International Film Festival, which was kind of weird, was a film called We Demand that looked at a guy by the name of James Roebuck, who is actually a U.S. representative. He represents West Philly, but he was also a graduate of Virginia Union, and it's looking at sort of student protests and the war. But once again, getting back towards a black university, when I think about what I want to do in terms of thinking about the connections between art and liberation and black studies, I'm looking towards, for example, what people are doing at Howard. This film, Sugar-Coated Arsenic, played at the New York Film Festival, and it was very interesting to me. I think the other black studies film that really, that played as well was Arthur Jafa's Dreams Are Colder Than Death, which is, to me, the embodiment of like black studies on film. Yeah. What I'm also trying to do in terms of thinking about black studies and art, I draw a lot from Virginia Union in the 1930s. There are some articles that Arthur P. Davis wrote in the Norfolk Journal and Guide about the role that drama can play in teaching and knowledge production and knowledge transference and all of these things. And so that's very much what influences me. So I must be honest, when I'm trying to think of how I'm constructing my pedagogical project or whatever my project is, I'm not looking towards really anything that's happening now. I'm oftentimes discouraged, but the university that I'm looking toward is oftentimes the HBCU of the 1930s and the 1940s. And so I'll stop there.
In a 1970 interview with CLR James, the Black Scholar Journal asked, "How does the future look for black studies?" CLR James responded, "That is a difficult question to answer, but a very serious one. I would like to say this, that if the American universities where black studies are established and separate look upon black studies as merely some sort of concession to satisfy the black students, that is not so. Black studies require a complete reorganization of the intellectual life and the historical outlook of the United States and world civilization as a whole. That is what the impact of black studies means. And if the instructors of the universities do not see that, then they will meet more trouble than ever before. I believe that the establishment of American universities should recognize that black studies is not a concession to black students, but a great opening and penetration into their own intellectual life and understanding. that here is an opportunity to extend the field of intellectual inquiry, which they have neglected up to now, a chance to penetrate more into the fundamentals of Western civilization, which cannot be understood unless Black studies is involved. We are listening to an exploration of Black studies and the Black University with Dr. Claudrena Harold, author of New Negro Politics in the Jim Crow South from the University of Virginia, Dr. Will Boone, Dr. Coy Walker, and myself of Winston-Salem State University. Continue to enjoy the rest of the program.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to be as long as my colleagues. They're very intellectual projects, are very rich, but I definitely want to be able to engage so we can get to the engagement part. As a person who does a lot of organizing, not only in academia but outside of academia, I think that it's very, very, very important to engage in the intellectual projects that we all bring to the table to address certain issues, which is like my colleague Will was saying about being an intellectual heretic. So I'm a heretic in everything, I guess I should say. So how I came to the Black Studies and the Black University and my own project was I'm engaged in the praxis of resistance. And what I mean by praxis is how does discourse, theory, and practice all communicate with each other to create alternative forms of thinking, but also push us into moving to address issues and phenomena that affects us as Black people wherever we are in the world. So with that added component, the last component means that obviously I'm an internationalist. Everything I do has to be within the context of an international setting. And so we know Black Studies was born out of struggle. We know this, and we are currently engaged in a struggle. In the U.S., students have been calling attention to racism on PWI campuses. And I mean, all of us are intellectuals, but we also, very, very important, but hasn't there always been racism at PWIs? So to call attention to it, but also it's almost kind of a contradiction, right? So how do we understand that? But this is also going on in a time that students in the rest of the African world, such as the youth activists in Burkina Faso of the Citizens Broom, which is, please don't get me into French, I don't speak French, but it's Bali Citizen, which is Citizens Broom, are from Senegal, the Yin Amari, which means we are fed up, are from South Africa, the Fees Must Fall, the Rose Must Fall, are the Talima movement in DRC. These young people seem to have a different understanding of what it means for education, but also what it means to struggle for one's agency in a world that does not like you. Now, the interesting thing is that we're looking at this world in an African context, that you have African people with an education system that is more colonial, right? So this whole question of students calling attention to racism on PWI campuses, the question actually becomes, that I think becomes important, and the reason why Black Studies and a Black University becomes a real radical place and a real fertile place is because if we were to look at that in the context of black students in the colonial situation, how do we look at the Black University and Black Studies in the United States? Is it still a colonial situation? So in doing that, we know that these students have been demanding a better world, the decolonization of their education, which has multiple links to their human agency, right? So the idea that you're struggling in a colonial system, these students, these young people in Africa, are struggling against a colonial system that addresses their very human existence. How do we juxtapose that to what's happening here in the United States with Black students on white campuses? And then the question becomes, how do we intersperse that with Black Studies and the Black University, right? So how do we understand those? So what I would like to add to this conversation is the idea that the condition of Black education and the role of Black Studies in the Black University must be understood, analyzed, and addressed as a colonial and anti-colonial contradiction, all right? So being so, the current state of Black education that means educating black people overall, or the education of African people, has three components that I think that once you look at it through a colonial situation, that you'll probably see what I'm talking about. Well, first, we know that black education in the United States, specifically educating black people, whether it's on white campuses, but also a lot of times on black campuses as well, seeks to create an educated class of individuals that consistently seek to reinscribe the processes of self-marginalization. All right, let me repeat that. The processes of education seeks to create an educated class, educated as in quotes, class of individuals that consistently seek to reinscribe the processes of self-marginalization, producing a class of individuals who think they are thinking, to borrow from Kwame Ture in one of his speeches. Capitalism thinks that, it makes us think that we're thinking, right? So you have an educated class of individuals who are actually reinscribing this process, right? The second part is that the second component to this education also seeks to replace the cultural, ancestral, and historical memory with the normalcy of violent realities. And to step out of this, or to question this reality, is to commit social, political, economic, and also a lot of times family suicide. So then you're now marginalizing yourself. You're living in a colonial situation. Again, we're looking at this question of the role of black universities, of black studies, in this overall question of struggle, not only here in the United States, but across the world, right? And lastly, but most importantly, education as we understand it within the context of black education and producing an educated class of individuals, it seeks to replace an internationalist worldview with a worldview that sees itself as being alone, individualist, apart from. Now we know this is ahistorical. If we look at the idea and study anything that have to do with Pan-Africanism, whether you look at the different forms of it, it was always internationalist. I often tell students that the first time that the first person was snatched off of the continent, everything became international, right? So this idea that you're separate and apart, and that we're struggling within the context of only what I also am working on, this idea of struggle exceptionalism. This struggle exceptionalism in the black community here indicates that we're struggling. Our struggle is something different than our contemporaries, our colleagues in Africa, Latin America. And there's obviously, again, we go back to this educated class of individuals, right? Because we are leaders, so to speak, whatever that means, right? So this ahistorical has created this psychosis in black movements emanating from the United States, again, to what I call struggle exceptionalism. So those 3 points are the main points that I hope that we can really engage in. And like I said, I wasn't going to be long because I really want to get into the engagement of this particular panel. And I wanted to end with this particular note. And the reason why I'm looking at this as an anti-colonial and a colonial contradiction, specifically when we're looking at the idea of black studies in the black university in the grand scheme of things. And the role of us as being not only educators, but also students, teachers, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, because when we're talking about black studies, and as my colleague said, we got to look at this, we have to look at the archive, but we also got to look at our family archives as well. So what we're doing is that we're taking black studies out and placing it back into this organic form, this organic struggle that is emanating from its roots. So how we conceptualize a problem or phenomenon will certainly guide how we address it. And the other day I was listening to, and I'll end with this. The other day I was listening to our brother Dr. Cornel West. He was going, kind of digging in on Hillary Clinton, and he started to kind of throw around this concept of this neoliberal black political class. Now, although that sounds very, very good, what the problem with that is that we look at it, it becomes very limited. And I think that we need to push our discourse, again, because I'm looking at practice of resistance. How does discourse, theory, and practice guide our actions, right? So I'm also saying that that's a limited conceptualization. I think that we need to look at it as a neo-colonial black political class. So once we start to look at it within that particular context, now how we address issues are going to become multiple. Our discourse will be able to fit, we will be able to develop models to fit the multiple levels of marginalization that we as people self-perpetuate, but also that is superimposed upon us in our everyday lives. And I'll end there.
Interestingly, each of the comments, each of the presentations have provided a number of notes, and I entered this conversation. I can remember when I first heard Claudrina speak, and it was like a light went off. I mean, it was, you ever find that you're really your close intellectual partner, you're like, that's it, that's the person. And with Cheryl, our Fourth Afternoon Collective, we used to meet and just talk, and it was probably one of the most fertile periods, intellectual periods of my life, but it really animated why I was visiting archives, why certain questions were being raised, and also enabled me to begin to think about certain intellectual and political positions, particularly black universities and elite white universities. Having been formed and shaped at HBCUs, Norfolk State and Virginia Union, and also being shaped at white universities, I guess the two oldest in the U.S., Harvard and the College of William and Mary. So you try to begin to marry that. How do you begin to think that space? And finding the space of black studies was not so much black studies as a discipline, not so much as a book, but as a particular way of seeing the world, engaging the world, and engaging people. And it was Reginald Butler at the Woodson Institute that really opened up the space where we began to think through, how do you look at forms of knowledge production and reproduction? And we created a little center for the study of local knowledge. And it was from that center that gave me a lot of ideas, gave me a lot of space to think, and space to open up new questions. And so what I'd like to offer to this conversation is that if we're reconsidering this notion of black studies in the black university from this particular vantage point, from our vantage point in the here and now, I want us to begin to think about this idea of the challenge of blackness itself. And I call this the challenge of blackness, Africana studies, and the imagination of matter. And that last idea, the imagination of matter, is drawn from the thought of none other than Charles Long, who I've been thinking with for a whole number of years. And of course, the challenge of blackness comes from Lerone Bennett. And there are three quotes that sort of organize my thinking. One is from Cedric Robinson, who writes, "Hegemonic control of black studies is as important to capital as any other field of knowledge production." It's as simple as that. The second one comes from 1847 proceedings of the National Convention of Colored People. In that convention, the resolution of that convention, it was stated, "Our warfare lies in the field of thought." 1847. So for folks who want to talk about now, we have to get to the archives. We got to go back. I see Derek back there, of course, with Institute of the Black World. We still got enough work. And the last one comes from the Institute of the Black World, and it comes from their particular manifesto. The Institute of the Black World is a gathering of black intellectuals who are convinced that the gifts of their minds are meant to be fully used in the service of the black community. It is therefore an experiment with scholarship in the context of struggle. In many ways, what we are witnessing here at WSSU with our colleagues across the nation is really this particular experiment. This is what we're doing. Otherwise, we would not be here. At the first Black Studies Directors Seminar convened by the Institute of the Black World in 1969, Lerone Bennett issued a critical epistemological and ethical challenge to those assembled regarding the intellectual and political problem space of blackness in the academy and in broader society. Under the title, "The Challenge of Blackness," Bennett challenged the directors to view the issue of blackness as not just a mere descriptive of a condition elaborated within the geopolitical and historical confines of a distinctly Western and uniquely American imaginary. Rather, he reformulates a challenge for blackness as the elaborations of the condition of possibility for an other knowledge and other order of being. Recognizing the limitations of the dominant episteme, Bennett states, "We are about the task of defining, defending, and illustrating blackness. We believe blackness is a total challenge, And because of that fact, and because of the fact that at a certain level, basic conflicts of interest express themselves as conflicts of rationalities, we see the rationality of blackness as a total challenge to the world. The critical achievement of Bennett's statement is the acuity and integrity of defining the intellectual task of black studies as one that opens up the theoretical, methodological, and categorical implications of blackness for elaborating a new order of knowledge commensurate with new political orders of an emerging world. Blackness becomes the very foundation, the condition of possibility for another knowledge and another way of life. It is a chaos that is the cosmos of new opportunities for creating new forms of collective life. For the project of Black Studies, blackness oscillates within that political and intellectual nexus so elegantly captured by the words of Toni Morrison when she writes, "There is no romance free of what Herman Melville called the power of blackness, especially not in a country in which there was a resident population already black, upon which the imagination could play, through which historical, moral, metaphysical, and social fears, problems, and dichotomies could be articulated." In many ways, Bennett's challenge would enter a political and intellectual terrain that would by necessity try to re-territorialize it within the regime of the given. That is, Bennett's call to an open thinking of blackness was arrested by the very conditions of the theoretical and material development that would suture it to a singular instance of blackness as problem, as pathology, as abnormality. In other words, blackness, and by recourse, black studies, came to emerge as the latest signifier of the Negro problem, to which an answer must come from within the prevailing calculus of the order of knowledge. Thus, the response was tied to a logic of correspondence, which the categorical frames of thought were always already given. To the question, how does it feel to be a problem? The response was not an open silence that refuses the categorical logic in the manner of W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk when he says, "I seldom answer a word," but rather it was a condition best captured by Richard A. Long's 1971 Atlanta University Center for African and African American Studies occasional paper number 3, Black Studies Year 1, when he writes, "In the last few years, quote, Operation Culturally Deprived, a series of interrelated activities grouped around the concept of the disadvantage, cultural deprivation, social fragmentation, and psychological shipwreck has become a mammoth industry and a classic boondoggle. There is a danger that black studies may follow the same course if they follow certain trends. The first trend is imperialism, the involvement of institutions without expertise in black culture that, until recently, didn't even admit blacks. The second is paternalism on the part of foundations who decide in which direction black studies should go. The third is nihilism, not Cornel West, this Richard Long, 1971. The third is nihilism, caused by the demand for black studies, often lacking in content, to be taught by blacks and only for blacks. The fourth is materialism, whereby black studies becomes a major source of profit for the software industry. Another basic danger is that black studies will make analogies to white studies that have no relation to black people, i.e. black Freudianism. The hope The hope is for black studies to address the life and history of blacks in America by avoiding the inherent dangers spoken thereof. The challenge of blackness serves to inaugurate a foundational challenge to the protocols of society and the academy, as well as the dictates of what we term disciplinary knowledge. Blackness is the fuel of this intellectual insurgency that propels the innovative theoretical feats of those scholars who embrace this particular event. Indeed, what is at stake is nothing less the integrity of knowledge's organization according to a profound commitment to the history of thought and to culture, which brings into the open the mostly latent and only occasionally exposed differences in the university between the attitudes that holds politics and learning to be wholly separate, and that which knows them to be an uneasy symbiosis. What I would like to do now is, that's sort of an opening statement of what Black Studies should be. For time, this is a longer paper. We move through then Charles Long's thought that opens up this space of the imagination of matter, which is the necessity of trying to think through the phenomenology of black bodies across space and time, developing the requisite categorical and theoretical constructs that enable us to think these black bodies. And to then discipline, not discipline in the sense of the categorical logic of European epistemes, but to discipline that form of thought within an institutional space that can then host the learning and teaching and transmission of that knowledge across space and time. That is the Black university to which we're discussing. That's the Black university to which we're trying to build. As an intellectual formation, in our period of cognitive capital, coupled with new global flows of financial capital, along with the logic of empire, the task at hand is to interrupt and foreclose the finality and destination of imperial culture in which the Negro intellectual is fully immersed. In other words, the challenge for the contemporary Africana Studies student and scholar consists in undertaking the hard work of interrogating contemporary configurations of the intellectual, ethical, and political nexus of our moment, and exploit those gaps and open up new fissures within the imperial theoretical imaginary, and open up and enable us to operationalize a differential thinking. Africana Studies goes beyond a mere interdisciplinarity, that is just a mere separate and additive function, to an already integrative and synthetic one, whereby ideas, concepts, methods, and theories are formed, consolidated into a new field of study, and then marketed to a capitalist academy. Our task for Black Studies attempts to think the challenge of blackness. Thus, we approach the project as a type of afterthinking. And such an afterthinking, perhaps, just perhaps, we may approach a critical understanding of the protein character of blackness, which will enable us to illuminate the fundamental and what we term the unthought. In order to think in this manner, we must critically understand that the past and present present dynamic changes between culture, capital, and commerce, and that this particular flow then elaborates new logics and technologies of fundamentally what it means to be human. As Charles Long so aptly put it in his essay, The Humanities and Other Humans, the question is raised, given the actual or possible worlds we live in, is it adequate for us to derive our fundamental orientation, our fundamental meaning and data simply from Hebraic, Greek, Christian meanings of our culture, and we should add their derivatives, because it is their derivatives which haunt many of our intellectual projects. What Long points us to is a necessary incompleteness in our intellectual skies. This necessary incompleteness cannot be categorized. It cannot be contained under our current discourse. And it is this incompleteness, this type of thinking, which enables us to really host blackness under a conceptual container, the imagination of matter.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms, email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist, Mwizi Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent, Funa Ngunda, senior researcher and content contributor, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui. Technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology. And creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
I own the hour.